So there's a lot of controversy around edit distance in the translation world, and whether or not it can be a good or valid measure for translation effort, right? And I think that first let's start by describing what edit distance is. Again, very quick recap. If you get a sentence with more or less 10 words, let's say 10 words for instance, and if you add, move, delete, change any of those words, that's going to count for 1 over 10 edit distance. So if you add 1 word in 10, that's going to be an edit distance of 10%. If you add 2 or change, if you add 1 word and then change another word, that's an edit distance of more or less 20. 2 in 10, right? And edit distance can get more complex. It can be character-based as opposed to word-based, and you can differentiate the algorithm, but the essence remains the same, right? The essence is the number of edits, additions, changes, removals over the total number of words in a specific amount of text, right? That's the edit distance. Now, there's been a lot of controversy as whether or not edit distance is an effective way of measuring effort. And I think a lot of the debate centers around what is edit distance? Is it accurate? Is it not accurate? Is it good? Is it not good? Is it moral? Is it immoral? And then underlying the edit distance is this assumption that by paying people by edit distance, people will make less money. So that is the core assumption. And I think everybody can agree that making less money is bad, right? In a capitalist society like ours, people need to make more money in order to live a better kind of life. So that's kind of commonly established. When you associate edit distance with paying people less, it becomes a force of evil. But I want to challenge that notion. I think that on the surface, and if you think about how edit distance gets applied, it probably means for a lot of people that they get paid less. But it also means that other forces are shifting. So beyond the edit distance, and much more important than the edit distance, is how you use the edit distance to decide what someone should be making. And let's talk about 2 wildly different scenarios, right? Let's say that you decide you're the project manager or the agency owner or an enterprise localization buyer. If you choose to pay the people working for you, your vendors, let's say 10% of their word rate for reading and confirming a sentence, and you pay them 70% for the first change and 80% for the second change and 90% or 100% for anything more than 2 changes on average, right, in the segment of 10 words, hypothetically. You're going to be encouraging certain kind of behavior, right? You're going to be encouraging people are either going to be very dissatisfied because 10% is an incredibly low rate for reading. And they're either going to be encouraged in this scenario to either just confirm everything flat out without even reading it, or to make changes everywhere so that they can reach standards that are closer to their full word ratio. So regardless of the edit distance, in this framework, you're pressuring vendors into a certain kind of behavior and a certain kind of outcome. Now, let's say in another scenario, you're paying vendors, let's say 90% of their word rate just for reading and confirming, and then for any kind of change, you're paying them 100%. Both frameworks are using edit distances. Both are creating wildly different outcomes. Let's say in the case where you're paying 90%, perhaps from an economic perspective, that's not going to be very advantageous for the person buying the translation, but it certainly is going to be very advantageous for the person receiving those translations. Because now, without having to type it all, just by reading and confirming a segment, a translator or vendor would be making approximately, not exactly, 90% of their full word rate, right? That sounds, if you ask me, I would take that proposal any day. Now, there are a lot of sub-problems that stem from this, right? The main problem that I see is that people have no idea what fair means. And that's very common with technology that's new. Again, another fallacy in the sense that it's not new, right? Edit distances have been around since the 1960s, and we're talking about the Levenstein edit distance algorithm. It's been around for a very long time, and this isn't anything new. what's surprising is that we haven't been able to transform all of this abundance of technological wealth into material day-to-day practices. So when we look at this, trying to understand what is fair, that's where we would need to have a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of statistical data to help us. Because other than the statistical data, we're left to a bartering system where, let's say, I'm the translation owner and you're the vendor, and I offer you 10% for confirming and editing, and you say, no, 10% is ridiculous, I'm never going to work for you again. You ask 90, I'll offer you 20. You ask 80, I'll offer you 30. You ask 70, I'll offer you 40. You ask 60, I'll offer you 50. Eventually we agree on 50, for instance, right, in a bartering system. But most interactions these days don't work in a bartering kind of way, in a way that, let's say, the exchange kind of tends to find a happy, a place where nobody's too happy, nobody's too upset about the outcome, right? We live in especially our sector is very much supply chain based, where you have the translation owner with all of the power and the translation vendor with very little negotiation power, because basically translation has been, for the most part, unless you're highly, highly specialized and has incredibly differentiated yourself, translation is something rather commoditized. So that means that, if you're too expensive, I'll just find the next person over. So this commoditization of translation has made it very difficult for people to be able to differentiate. Now, what does that mean from an edit distance perspective? It typically means that agencies and translation owners, they'll just set down the law, and they're going to say, you know what, from now on it's 20% for reading and confirming, and it's 30% for this, and it's 50% for that. And when rules are set down in this way, they are very disempowering on one hand, or could be potentially disempowering, and they're typically not considering the fullness of the situation. Again, if you look at it from a statistical perspective, you would probably be able to determine that, for instance, on average, and again, this is just hypothetical, but let's say you would be able to determine that on average, a translator would take 40 or 30% of the time they would normally take to translate from scratch to read and confirm a translation segment. Again, I say on average, and that this idea of statistics is very, very important in all of this discussion. When you look at things at an individual level, it's true. Maybe I'll take 10 minutes to translate a few words because I'm going to research them, and I'm going to call my friend, and I'm going to try different things and not be happy with the situation. That happens. But for the most part, if you measure my work across 1,000 segments, you're probably going to find that on average I'm taking maybe 20 seconds per segment. So averages and statistical notions are very important in these conversations, because it's very easy to find outliers here and there, places where I spent a second, places where I spent 10 minutes. And so it's hard to understand, and most people understand language as something very specific, right? When we talk about language, we even learned this, right? With literature, we want to bring specific examples out. We don't learn typically to think about language from a statistical perspective, which actually makes things worse in this regard. So it's very hard for us to first and foremost agree on what makes sense from a payment perspective. And I think that's why ultimately we should be working backwards instead of just thinking about edit distance, right? The backward calculation, in my opinion, is what is a dignified amount of pay that different translators of different levels should have received in different kinds of geographies. Very difficult for people to agree on this, right? It's like, it's one of those things that is incredibly hard for people to agree. And again, because it's a very commoditized field, because for the most part, you do not need to be accredited by a certain board, or you don't require a certain license to be able to act as a professional translator. What you need is the knowledge, the skills. And once you have those skills, you're in game. So in my opinion, when we talk about the problem of edit distance, we're actually talking about the problem of how do we pay people properly for their effort, right? And that creates a whole other kind of series of questions, which is how you measure that effort. And that's where edit distance comes in. In my opinion, it's currently probably one of the least worst ways of measuring translation effort, whether I understand that it has a ton of problems, a ton of issues, but at scale, if worked correctly, right? This is the key if worked correctly with a financial model that is fair and rewards people in a dignified manner for their work, it can at scale represent some measure of effort, right? Other people are going to argue that time is much more accurate. Other people are going to argue that just pure word count is more accurate, or that you can pay people by pre-analysis but not by post-analysis. I mean, different people are going to have different kinds of opinion on the matter. But the key thing is that when we talk about edit distance, what seems to be like a linguistic technical matter really is a matter of money. It's a matter of how do you translate this effort into pay, right? And I think that's at the heart of maybe what I believe to be the biggest problem for translation and localization in the coming years, which is as these models get better, how we're still, in my opinion, not only going to need, but we're actually going to rediscover the human ingenuity in this process as something much more important than we could ever have expected before. And then we're going to have to figure out a way to compensate people for that. And that question is a very complex question, because do you compensate people for time? And what does that mean? If I'm slower than you are, does it mean that you're rewarding me for being slower? If I make unnecessary changes all the time, are you reward and you don't, and you make only the important changes, are you going to reward me for making unnecessary changes? So both edit distance and edit time have their intricate and complex, maybe even irresolvable problems. Then if you start tying into outcome, whether or not the translation turns out good and how well it turned out. And again, very difficult to measure, very difficult to tie all these things together. So ultimately, in my opinion, we're in a space where most people don't have really good answers for how to go about it. So then because we don't have good answers, the space kind of divides itself into different camps, into people who are screaming and saying edit distance sucks, boo, down with edit distance, and other people saying edit distance is great, and maybe they're saying it silently, but they're using it, but they feel a little bit ashamed of using it, and maybe they don't feel comfortable. But nonetheless, the space keeps dividing itself because people are using things and adopting ideologies and points of view that are not really based on informed opinions and dialogue, but rather on entrenchment and encampment in certain ideas. And I understand, this happens mainly because we are working with an oppressor-oppressed ideology in our space. You have, the mighty oppressors, the ones who hold the work and who can decide who's going to perform the work. And then you have the people who perform the work who are being oppressed by these oppressors. And because the dialogue isn't based on a common ground, and because we don't have even translation buyers who are typically educated in the matter, it becomes typically structured as a race to the bottom, right? And that's all a very complex economic web that needs to be untangled, or at least deeply massaged, so that we can find better outcomes, right? Because again, for me, it's inevitable. Models will get better. Machine translations are already better than they've ever been before. They will continue to get better. In my opinion, that is an inevitability. The other inevitability is that we're going to need human language caretakers, people who are going to be looking at the language, if not from a compliance perspective, from a literature perspective, not from a literature perspective, from an empathy perspective. Human touch, in my opinion, will still be important. And then the question is, how do you measure that human touch? Maybe you believe in time, maybe you believe in edit distance, maybe you believe in another methodology that I've never heard about. Fact is, we're going to have to find a way to accurately measure and compensate for effort. And I think that's an undeniable question in our space. I think it's the big elephant in the room. And I think it's a very uncomfortable, thorny subject, and that's why very few people openly discuss it. But we'd love to know your comments and thoughts in the comments. And thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time.